Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think virtually everyone who is coming is here. Now, usually my role is to introduce the speaker and then moderate the conversation. So I'm going to welcome you and introduce myself, give a paper and then moderate a discussion about the paper. Now, everyone here knows who I am and I know who you are, but for the benefit of for the benefit of the hundreds of thousands of people watching this on YouTube, my name is Jonathan Cole and I'm the Acting Executive Director of the Australian Centre for Christianity and Culture. And I have the world's shortest introduction because there's really only one thing you need to know about me in terms of my scholarship. I'm a scholar of political theology, and I underscore the preposition of for reasons that you'll understand in about 30 minutes or less, because the paper is on Edmund Burke, and the title is Politics in the Pulpit are Terms That Have Little Agreement, which is a quote from Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. But the all-important part of the title is what comes after the colon, Burke's critique of the political theologian, which is one reason why I describe myself as a scholar of political theology, not a political theologian. So I have done a dry run and I didn't get this in under 30 minutes in spite of cutting out some parts of the paper. So hence, without any further ado, I'm going to dive straight in because time is of the essence. Edmund Burke appears to have been one of the earliest writers to use the term political theologian in English. Indeed, it is possible that he was the first, which of course would make him the coiner of the term, at least in English. The term in question occurs in his Reflections on the Revolution in France, which has a much longer title if you're familiar with the work, and hereafter I'll refer to it as Reflections, which was published in 1790. Whether Burke coined the term, was the first to put it into print, or was merely one of the earliest to employ it in English, the fact remains that this early, possibly first occurrence of the term has gone unnoticed and or unremarked in the contemporary literature on political theology. I am yet to find a single reference to this fact. Now, the primary purpose of this article is to redress this lacuna. And at this point, I need to state that you'll find when we get to the end of the paper, I don't actually do any critical evaluation of Burke's thought about the relationship between the church and state, because the contribution of this article is the fact that it's going to exist once I publish it, because I'm going to write what, as far as I can see, will be the very first article exploring Burke's use of this term, political theologian, and its significance. Now, the single instance of the term political theologian, actually political theologians plural, occurs in the context of Burke's polemic against Dr. Richard Price, a, quote, non-conforming minister of eminence, end quote, who was enthused by the revolution in France. Price gave what Burke describes as a very extraordinary and miscellaneous sermon, in which support for the French Revolution was, quote, the grand ingredient in the cauldron, end quote. Burke concedes that Price's sermon contained, quote, some good moral and religious sentiments, end quote, but these were, quote, mixed up in a sort of porridge with various political opinions and reflections, end quote, that Burke found deeply troubling. Burke pronounces the following verdict on the sermon in which the term political theologian appears. For my part, I looked on that sermon as the public declaration of a man much connected with literary cabbalers and intriguing philosophers, with political theologians and theological politicians, both at home and abroad. I know they set him up, this is Dr. Price, as a sort of oracle, because with the best of intentions in the world, he naturally philippizes and chaunts his prophetic song in exact unison with their designs. Suffice to say, Burke's deployment of the term political theologians in this context is not complimentary. It is also worth noting that Price is not specifically described as a political theologian. Rather, he is said to be much connected with political theologians, as well as theological politicians, literary cabbalists, and intriguing philosophers, which is to say a group or groups of individuals for whom Burke has contempt. That said, we can infer from Burke's critical account of Dr. Price's sermon something of their nature and characteristics, given that sermon is said to reflect the thought of the aforementioned identities. The purpose of this essay is to explicate the meaning of the term political theologians in Burke's reflections and to make sense of the opprobrium attached to it. This necessitates not only an analysis of the immediate context in which the phrase occurs in Reflections, but also an analysis of the text in its entirety. Because elsewhere in Reflections, Burke presents a rather positive, optimistic, and even laudatory picture of the intimate and complementary relationship between the church and state in England. He will later assert, for example, that church and state are, quote, ideas inseparable, end quote, in the minds of the English, and form part of an, quote, indissoluble union, end quote. Burke offers in Reflections an account of the relationship between church and state that seemingly problematizes his withering critique of Dr. Price's, quote, political sermon, end quote. Now, while the task at hand is straightforward in concept, it's actually quite complicated in practice by the nature of Burke's letter. The complication best explained by Burke himself when he says early in the letter, indulging myself in the freedom of epistolary intercourse, I beg leave to throw out my thoughts and express my feelings just as they arise in my mind, with very little attention to formal method. Burke's account of the relationship between the church and state and the occurrence of the all-important phrase political theologians do not occur together in Reflections, nor is either elaborated systematically. This unavoidably necessitates a process of extrapolation and reconstruction. Making matters worse are the presence of some ambiguities in several key passages that deal with the relationship between the church and state, thus imposing some degree of inference and speculation on the part of the interpreter. But as Ian Hampshire Monk has aptly observed, Burke wrote as a politician and rhetorician, not as an academic or philosopher. He wrote to persuade, not to satisfy the canons of logic. Well, finally, I will endeavour to show that Burke's criticism of the political theologian is actually compatible with his account of the relationship between church and state. Burke's criticism of Price's political sermon occasioned the following reflections on the nature of politics and the church that are illuminative of the slur political theologian. And it is a slur. Yet politics and the pulpit are terms that have little agreement. No sound ought to be heard from the church but the healing voice of Christian charity. The cause of civil liberty and civil government gains as little as that of religion by this confusion of duties. Those who quit their proper character to assume what does not belong to them are for the greater part ignorant, both of the character they leave and of the character they assume, wholly unacquainted with the world in which they are so fond of meddling, and inexperienced in all its affairs, on which they pronounce with so much confidence they have nothing of politics but the passions they excite. Surely the church is a place where one day's truce ought to be allowed to the dissensions and animosities of mankind. This passage, which shortly follows the appearance of the term political theologians, suggests a rationale for Burke's alarm at the conjunction of theology and politics. Politics and the church are things fundamentally incompatible, in Burke's view, because they possess distinct characters and perform different duties in society. Accordingly, the conflation of their functions, what Burke calls confusion of duties, unavoidably leads to the corruption of their character. And this potential for corruption, interestingly, is reciprocal although we're never given any detailed account of how politics is corrupted by the intrusion of theology. In Burke's account, the politician who strays into matters theological and the theologian who strays into matters political are both ignorant of the character they purportedly represent, as well as the character they seek to adopt. A proper understanding of the distinct characters and roles of the church and politics ought to lead to a careful observance of the demarcation between them. In a simple sense, then, the political theologian and the theological politician are two sides of the same coin. Individuals who understand neither the character of politics nor the character of theology. Political theology, Burke suggests, is an oxymoron. The oxymoronic rhetorical function of the term political theologian is mirrored by other phrases Burke uses as epithets of opprobrium for Dr. Price. He describes him derisively as this spiritual doctor of politics, characterising his speech to the Revolution Society as a political sermon, and also making reference in the same breath to the, quote, propagators of this political gospel, end quote. Burke uses the phrases spiritual doctor of politics, political sermon, political gospel, and of course political theologian, ironically, as part of a rhetorical strategy to evoke the obvious, as he sees it, absurdity of the conjunction of such contradictory terms. The distinction that Burke discerns in the respective characters of politics and the church ultimately seems to inhere in a conception, perhaps experience, of politics as a fulcrum of human conflict. The character of the church, according to Burke, is to be a source of charity. No sound ought to be heard in the church but the healing voice of Christian charity, as well as a refuge or sanctuary from dissension and animosity. Surely the church is a place where one day's truce ought to be allowed to the dissensions and animosities of mankind. Politics, Burke implies, is characterised by dissension, animosity, and a distinct absence of charity. And although not explicitly stated as such, there is a sense, I think, in which Burke is intimating that the proper political role of the church is actually its political neutrality. The church is supposed to serve as a non-political or apolitical counterpoint or counterbalance to the conflict and competition characteristic of politics. This at least would make sense of the notion that politics and the pulpit possess distinct and incompatible characters, and moreover that the political theologian is someone who does not understand this important distinction. There's actually an interesting passage in an unrelated part of Reflections that lends support to this interpretation and offers potential insight into the virtues Burke sees in the non-political character of religious institutions. In this particular passage, Burke praises the former monastic institutions of England, which the Reformation largely decimated, for serving as, quote, mechanisms of political benevolence. Their political virtue and contribution rested in their possession of, quote, revenues with a public direction, end quote, stewarded by, quote, men wholly set apart and dedicated to public purposes without any other public ties and public principles, men without the possibility of converting the estate of the community into private fortune, end quote. If nothing else, this passage illustrates the virtue Burke sees in the existence of non-political institutions where the public good is pursued in contrast to private interest, one source of political conflict. It also illustrates Burke's belief that religious institutions can play, and had played historically in England, this particular role. Burke does offer a second reason, however, that the distinct characters of the church and politics ought to be recognised and preserved, and they are knowledge and experience. Burke, who was an experienced parliamentarian and accomplished political thinker, he was actually quite famous in his day, and this book was one of the first bestsellers in English history. believe it or not. He decried the ignorance that preachers bring to bear on politics. There was that line, wholly unacquainted with the world in which they are so fond of meddling and inexperienced in all its affairs, on which they pronounce with so much confidence. They have nothing of politics but the passions they excite. Burke is keenly aware that politics is a domain of human life that can be both experienced and studied. When the uninitiated and unstudied way into political matters, they risk speaking with ignorance. What's worse, all that such ignorance can achieve in Burke's view is to excite political passions, thus inflaming the conflict that is already characteristic of politics, and which, if unconstrained, threatens the fabric of society as exhibited at the time he was writing in France. Elsewhere in Reflections, Burke identifies religion as one source of political extremism, saying, quote, "Those who profess principles of extremes and who under the name of religion teach little else than wild and dangerous politics." End quote. If it is true that Burke envisaged the church serving as a politically neutral counterpoint or counterbalance to the conflict of politics, then it is not difficult to understand his concern about preachers inflaming political passions with their ignorant political pontifications. Burke would rather see preachers preach charity and provide sanctuary and respite from the human dissensions and animosities that are readily on display in politics. This pastoral role is essential for constraining the destructive tendencies of politics, which actually accords the church a vital role in politics, although perhaps one that is counterintuitive, which I would describe as this: the greatest contribution the church can make to politics is to maintain and preserve a character that contrasts the character of politics, such that there might be a social force countervailing the destructive impulses of human nature, a perpetual risk of being unleashed by the passions excited by politics. Burke's account of the relationship between politics and the church can be summarised as follows. Politics and the church possess distinct characters that serve different functions in society. The church ought to be a place of charity and a refuge from human conflict, whereas politics is an arena of unavoidable human conflict and passions. Conflating this important distinction of character undermines the proper character of both. And then, as an additional reason that the pulpit should stay out of politics, is that the clergy who preach in it, as a general rule, lack the practical experience and knowledge required to talk intelligently and wisely about political matters, in which case their contributions risk exacerbating political conflict, not ameliorating it. So I'm now going to broaden out and bring in some other parts of Reflections, the parts that problematise, but also ultimately, thanks to my genius analysis, actually illuminate precisely why Burke is so critical of this conjunction of theology and politics. There's one passage in particular which really stands out for its relevance to the discussion thus far. And Burke introduces this particular discussion by, quote, begging leave to speak of our church establishment, end quote, which he describes as the first of our prejudices. Now, if you're familiar with the work of Burke, you'll know that what he means by prejudice is a tradition or piece of received wisdom. It's an older meaning of the term, which now has unfortunate other connotations, and has created a lot of misunderstanding actually in relation to Burke's thought. So having established this topic of our church establishment, he says this, and this is a difficult and complex sentence. I've had to read it many, many times, so I can't imagine the difficulty you're going to have in grasping it as I read it out, so apologies in advance. 4, taking ground on that religious system of which we are now in possession, we continue to act on the early received and uniformly continued sense of mankind. That sense not only, like a wise architect, hath built up the august fabric of states, but like a provident proprietor, to preserve the structure from profanation and ruin, as a sacred temple purged from all the impurities of fraud and violence and injustice and tyranny, hath solemnly and forever consecrated the Commonwealth and all that officiate in it. This consecration is made that all who administer in the government of men, in which they stand in the person of God himself, should have high and worthy notions of their function and destination, that their hope should be full of immortality, that they should not look to the paltry pelf of the moment, nor to the temporary and transient praise of the vulgar, but to a solid, permanent existence in the permanent part of their nature, and to a permanent fame and glory in the example they leave as a rich inheritance to the world. Now, to state the obvious, this is a difficult passage to interpret, in large part because of the opacity of the term religious system, which is what the whole paragraph begins with. Given Burke has introduced the topic as our church establishment, which of course means the Church of England, he's writing in England, even though he's an Irishman, that's a whole other story. I think we're entitled to assume that religious system has something to do with the Church of England as the established church. But is Burke here talking about the liturgical worship of the Anglican Church, its charitable works, its contribution to learning and education, the piety and devotion it inspires, its theology and scriptures, its clergy, or all of the above and more besides? Well, it's really impossible to say based on what we have. And then, of course, there's the even more problematic phrase, the early received and uniformly continued sense of mankind, which forms the subject of at least part of the passage. And it is this sense of mankind which, quote, like a wise architect is said to have built up the august fabric of states, and like a provident proprietor has solemnly and forever consecrated the Commonwealth and all that officiate in it. I think it's quite possible that Burke has in view here either the doctrine of imago Dei or the fall, or perhaps both together, because he's talking about, if you analyse it carefully, it's this traditional Christian sense of mankind which has filtered through generations in English society, which he's linking to the constitutional order of England. The consecration idea is particularly interesting and comes in the context of some rather tortured syntax. Setting aside the oddity of the subject of the consecrating being the aforementioned rather inscrutable sense of mankind, the verb itself is ambiguous in this context. Does Burke mean to suggest that the Commonwealth, not to mention those who officiate in it, have been rendered sacred? Does he merely mean to suggest that there is something permanent and unalterable about the English Constitution? Or is the suggestion rather that the Commonwealth is given a special divine purpose, function or vocation in the affairs of humankind? Of the three, I think the latter seems most likely, particularly if we rearrange the syntax for the purpose of clarification, which would produce this particular idea. The early, received and uniformly continued sense of mankind hath solemnly and forever consecrated the Commonwealth and all that officiate in it, to preserve the structure from profanation and ruin, as a sacred temple, purged from all the impurities of fraud and violence and injustice and tyranny. The ultimate consecrated purpose of the state, it seems, is to be free of the destructive tendencies of humankind, much as a temple is, in brackets, or is supposed to be. But this notion appears to be at odds with the distinct, separate and incompatible characters of politics and the church enunciated earlier in Reflections, which we discussed at the outset. If we treat the language of like a temple as a rhetorical flourish or moment of rhetorical exuberance, which is always a possibility with Burke, then perhaps the consecration point is merely that the state has been given a higher divine purpose to help humans transcend their sinful, material, ephemeral existence in order to enable them to live together in peace and concord. In other words, a means of ensuring that politics does not devolve to, quote, this is from that passage, the paltry pelf of the moment, nor to the temporary and transient praise of the vulgar. There is support for this particular interpretation when Burke says, this consecration is made that all who administer in the government of men, in which they stand in the person of God, should have high and worthy notions of their function and destination. It is for the sake of his high and worthy function and destination that Burke affirms church establishment and cannot countenance an atheistic or irreligious society as some were then seeking to realise in France. And there are some extended parts in Reflections where he talks about this. The two immediately following passages are quite instructive in this regard. The first states that such sublime principles, in reference to the high and worthy function and destination for which the state is consecrated, quote, ought to be infused into persons of exalted situations and religious establishments provided that may continually revive and enforce them. Every sort of moral, every sort of civil, every sort of politic institution, aiding the rational and natural ties that connect the human understanding and affections to the divine, are not more than necessary in order to build up that wonderful structure. Here we see the role of the church come to light. The key role of the church is to remind and to continue to remind, quote, persons in exalted situations, i.e. those who officiate in the Commonwealth, the higher purpose and standard to which they are called and held to account. In light of Burke's earlier criticism of Dr. Price and the political theologian, the church can presumably accomplish this goal by simply doing what it is supposed to do in Burke's view, preach the gospel. The consecration of the state by a religious establishment, Burke continues, is necessary also to operate with an wholesome awe upon free citizens, because in order to secure their freedom, they must enjoy some determinate portion of power. To them, therefore, a religion connected with the state and with their duty towards it becomes even more necessary than in such societies where the people, by the terms of their subjection, are confined to private sentiments and the management of their own family concerns. All persons possessing any portion of power ought to be strongly and awfully impressed with an idea that they act in trust and that they are to account for their conduct in that trust to the one great master, author and founder of society. It is doubly important, according to Burke, for free citizens of a democracy, he thought democracy was part of the constitutional order of England, who have some portion of power, to live in a constitutional order involving a state religious establishment, to remind them also of their accountability to a higher power, the one great master, author and founder of society, aka God. At this juncture, it is worth keeping in mind that Burke's defence of the English constitution is an apologia against the revolution then occurring in France, and in particular to its English supporters like Dr. Price. Burke was genuinely fearful of the repercussions of the disestablishment of the Christian religion. We know, and it is our pride to know, he wrote, that man is by his constitution a religious animal, that atheism is against not only our reason but our instincts, and that it cannot prevail long. So in summation, the church, in Burke's view, is an absolutely vital part of the fabric of the state, of the constitutional order, holding political leaders and free citizens alike accountable to a higher standard and purpose that in his view is necessary to avert political ruin on account of the destructive side of human nature. In short, the church civilises humankind, and thus human politics. Assuming there's no politics in the pulpit, of course. The absence of religion means the absence of civil politics. But if the human being is by nature a religious animal, living in a consecrated state, preserved in its existence by an established Christian religion that helps humankind to avert political ruin, and to realise its high and noble political destination, how can political theology be an oxymoron? how can Burke claim that politics and the church possess distinct and incompatible characters that must be kept separate lest they corrupt each other? It's not long to go. The compatibility of Burke's account of the relationship between church and state and his account of the relationship between politics and the church hinges on the meaning of the term politics. While Burke uses the word politics in at least two senses, the primary sense in which he uses the term, it occurs 21 times in Reflections, including in the context of the discussion of the relationship between politics and the church, following the currents of our central term, political theologian, is something like an agenda for implementing a particular vision for the direction of the state. He speaks, for example, in two places of a scheme of politics in contexts which seem to signify a strategy or program to advance one particular perspective or goal relevant to the course or fate of the state. He says, for instance, the gentlemen of the Revolution Society, who were so early in their congratulations of the French Revolution, appear to be strongly of opinion that there is some scheme of politics relative to this country, England, in which your proceedings may in some way be useful. Burke speaks in one instance of politics having an object. The great object in these politics is to metamorphose France from a great kingdom into one great plague table. Burke further speaks of individuals and groups possessing a politics. Indeed, one instance of the term politics refers to Dr. Price's politics. Burke says, I certainly defer to Dr. Price's authority a good deal more in these speculations. He's talking about Price's speculations about population growth in France. There's really no topic that's not covered in the letter somewhere, than I do in his general politics. In another place, Burke avers that, quote, the power of the city of Paris is evidently one great spring in their politics, which is to say an asset or advantage in relation to a particular faction's agenda for the direction of the state. And in a similar vein, Burke writes, addressing the recipient of his letter directly, this relation of your army to the crown will, if I am not mistaken, become a serious dilemma in your politics, i.e. an obstacle or problem in the pursuit of your agenda. A term that I think is useful for clarifying Burke's aversion to preachers having their own politics is partisanship. Dr. Price's cardinal sin, it seems, was to be partisan, to take a position on such a contentious issue as the revolution then raging in France, and to pursue the partisan political agenda of trying to inspire a similar revolution in England. Being on the wrong side of this partisan debate, as Dr. Price was for Burke, was one thing. What I think Burke found particularly galling was that as a preacher, Dr. Price had no business involving himself in political partisanship, particularly a preacher from a theological and ecclesial tradition with a history of bloody intervention in English politics, an allusion Burke actually makes, where he notes that Dr. Price's sermon was, quote, in a strain which I believe has not been heard in this kingdom in any of the pulpits which are tolerated or encouraged in it since the year 1648, which is the English Civil War period, where those dissenters took over the state. Killed the king. Note, however, political theologian signifies a theologian who is partisan, and it is partisanship that undermines the character and role of the church in society, according to Burke. Note, however, that the confusion of duties decried by Burke is not that between the Christian and the political partisan. It is between the preacher or theologian and the political partisan, because the preacher and the theologian are, by their character, non-political vocations. Being partisan is, for better or for worse, part of the essential character of being a politician. The Parliament is, by its character, an appropriate place for political debate, for contest between clashing ideas and interests. The fact that a particular politician may happen to worship in church every Sunday does not constitute the sin of being a political theologian. In fact, worshipping in church every Sunday is presumably something to be encouraged in Burke's view. Given the politician, we will recall, needs to be constantly reminded by the non-political institution of the church of the higher calling for which humankind has been created and for which it is destined. In that regard, we might observe that Burke was not only a Christian politician himself, but a highly partisan politician. Reflections is in many ways a highly partisan work. Burke, after all, is on the side of the partisan divide from Dr. Price, is on the other side of the partisan divide from Dr. Price with respect to the question of the French Revolution and its significance for England. But Burke was neither a preacher nor a theologian, in which case his partisanship was appropriate to the character of his vocation and did not therefore undermine the character of the church. In sum, there is no contradiction here or even real tension between Burke's account of the relationship between the church and state on the one hand and the relationship between the church and politics in the partisan sense Burke gives to the term on the other. Politics and the state are very different concepts, and the church has a different relationship to each. It is the state, not politics, that is consecrated by the church, or God, or that unelaborated sense of mankind. It is the state, not politics, in which the church plays an important constitutive and constitutional role, and it is from the character of politics, not the state, that the church is called to be different. The political role of the church is to stand outside of and apart from politics with its perpetual contest of rival partisan agendas, divergent interests and conflicting visions. These are legitimate, or if not legitimate, then unavoidable and therefore appropriate roles to be performed by politicians in a state. They are just not legitimate roles for those preaching the gospel. Those who do preach a political gospel undermine the actual and vital political function of the church, on Burke's account, to be a beacon of non-partisanship, to civilise rulers and citizens alike, and to remind all those who officiate in the Commonwealth of their higher purpose as creatures of God. That's it.